Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's Attire Seminar Series. This is hosted by the Institute for Humanities in Africa at the University of Cape Town. And my name is Ralph Borland. We have some of our colleagues and guests here. And today's seminar speaker is Lisa Godson, who is a design historian from National College of Art and Design in Dublin. Lisa and I have known each other for a long time, from when I was doing my PhD in Dublin. And I've curated Lisa's work on the speculum onto an exhibition before that was a New York Museum of Modern Art and Science Gallery Dublin exhibition called Design and Violence. And Lisa wrote a text describing her work on the speculum for that exhibition. And more recently, Lisa has been writing about it for the V&A Museum in London, the Victoria and Albert Museum. This is one of the texts that Lisa supplied for the seminar, and the other is for the History Workshop Journal. So two texts have been circulated in advance of the seminar. Lisa Godson has written and studied and researched a number of things. One of them that I'd like to pick out is her contribution to the documentary Build Something Modern, which is about Irish architects working in Africa. And I think that's a production that we'd like to also see at Humor. Lisa has done a whole variety of work. I have a list of her publications here, including Uniform, Clothing and Discipline in the Modern World, Modern Religious Architecture in Germany, Ireland and Beyond, and Making 1916, Visual and Material Culture of the Easter Rising. So without further ado, I'm going to let Lisa introduce more of her topic. We know it's about the gynecological instrument, the speculum, and looking into its history, locating it, and looking at its future and current moves around the speculum as well. So Lisa, if you'd like to go ahead, please do.
Okay, thanks so much, Ralph, and thanks everyone for coming. I'm just going to share my screen now. I'm going to make it full screen. Can you all see that okay?
Good.
Yeah, okay. How do I do it? I could do it full screen a second ago. Let's see. I'm just going to leave it like that and scroll through if that's okay, so we don't waste any time. Okay, so thanks everyone for coming today, and thanks so much to Ralph and Divine and Huma for the invitation to speak to you and for asking you to engage with my work. It's a great honor to be able to be here with this format on kind of two counts. First of all, the work that Huma has been doing and I really admire it. And then secondly, while I've written and spoken about the speculum in many different fora, I'm almost at the end now, I hope, of drafting a much longer academic article of about 8,000 words. And so while the two pieces of writing that were circulated before the seminar were both commissioned for general audiences, I'm now trying to kind of approach it in a more kind of considered, maybe more sophisticated way. So this is really nice timing. So I hope that when I finish speaking, I can hear some of your views and suggestions, and I'm sure I'll learn from them. So just some of the material in this presentation may be a little bit distressing for some people, and I just thought I'd include that content warning for that. Okay, so what I want to do then today is provide some analysis about the speculum from both a historic and contemporary perspective. There are three key themes that kind of intertwine with one another throughout, which are visuality, feeling, and use. Along the way, I'll discuss the role of the speculum as an agent of experimentation, policing, control, and self-discovery. And I'd suggest that the history of the speculum suggests ways into a better understanding of histories of visuality and materiality, of looking and the regulation of women, taking on board the body as not just a tool affecting the material world, but as also modeled itself by materiality. So the reference to visuality and feeling in the title of my talk comes from how the biopolitics of the speculum's use is really overwhelmingly predicated on a politics of vision rather than feeling, where the design of the instrument implies that the user was and is the one who looks through the speculum, not the one whose body was and is looked at and who feels the effect of the instrument with their body. The object and use of the speculum is kind of central to this presentation. And this is the instrument that is inserted into the vagina, most typically in medical examinations, to dilate, hold open, and enable the inspection of the vagina and cervix. And this image here shows what is probably the most common form of speculum in use now, and that's the disposable plastic duck-billed type, as it's called. And then here's another kind of version of that, more or less the same, but in metal. And this is the Cusco type, in this case, as sold by Trans-Africa Medicals. So an alternative term for the same instrument, now obsolete, is the diopter, from the Greek to see through. And the word itself, speculum, is from the Latin to look at or observe. And as we can see, this list of this is from the Oxford English Dictionary, so it's a list of kind of all the potential meanings of the word speculum. And it kind of demonstrates that, as well as the instrument, it can mean a mirror, a drawing, a mark on a bird's wing, and so on. But basically, kind of baked into the object and into the meaning of the word is this idea of looking or visualizing. So in terms of kind of the speculum's history, as with the photograph on the screen, specula were used in ancient Greece and Rome, and also in Andalus in the early medieval period. So the oldest specula date to at least 100 years before the Common Era, and have been excavated in different parts of Libya, Bulgaria, Spain. They were then, and they usually took this form with the kind of the screw and the three prongs. They were then used occasionally from the early modern period, as in this illustration from 1580. So this speculum in this illustration is from a very early text on gynecology by Jan Roof. Medical historians of the early modern period in Europe have described the speculum in relation to the gradual displacement of midwifery by male obstetricians and an epistemological shift in the birthing arts from touch as knowing to seeing as knowing. So speculums only started really being used in this period, kind of late 16th century, 17th century. And this is a further image from the same text. As we can see, the female midwife and her attendants surround the laboring woman, while the men engage in the intellectual work of observing, mapping, and charting. They are experts in interpreting visual information. And various historians have described the use of the speculum in this period as the rupture or the fissure in traditional prohibitions on what men and women could see and touch in the birthing room, and as standing symbolically to legitimate the male medical gaze, the right of medical men to examine the interior of the female body, and thus to know what the female patient herself does not know. And that this knowledge comes from this supposed expertise in looking. And it's significant that this comes at a time that other visualizing technologies start becoming the basis of scientific knowledge, the telescope, early forms of microscope, and so on. So the speculum, in terms of the kind of the form it took, it more or less retained this form until the 19th century. And this is when there's a major intensification in the use of it as an instrument. And as we can see, so these are just kind of 6 examples, supposedly kind of dating from between the 1840s, 1880s. And as we can see, the actual forms it took then were hugely varied, more so I think than any other medical instrument. And it's really interesting, if you look at kind of the history of medical instruments, the speculum takes such a huge variety of forms. It's almost like more than any other kind of almost tool in the world, we were saying, other than maybe a corkscrew. That was the only thing we could kind of liken it to. And this kind of ambiguity about what exact form it should take is partly due to the way gynecology wasn't fully a profession until the later 19th century, but also because of competing innovators who were keen to have their name affixed to the instrument, and whose names are still affixed to the instrument, such as Sims and Cusco. And some of these types of speculum became notorious in their development and use. And I want to focus on two of them now. And these are both kind of 19th century examples. So here we see, well, two types of Sim speculum, and then the smaller image is of a kind of plastic disposable version of it, kind of in use today. So the inventor of this form of speculum was J. Marion Sims, sometimes called the father of American gynecology. And as a quotation from an endorsement of his memoirs says, this instrument caused his name to flash over the medical world like a meteor in the night. He's one of the best known physicians really of the kind of second half of the 19th century, not just in America, but also in Europe. He kind of traveled through Europe doing live demonstrations of his kind of speculum technique, and then also other surgical techniques. And this is a depiction of Sims. This is a very widely distributed image. So this was distributed by a pharmaceutical company, so for free, and hung in kind of countless doctors' offices and in kind of pharmacists in America, but also in Britain and Europe. And he's depicted here as kind of a great man of history. It's one of a series, Great Moments in Medicine. And he's holding the speculum that he designed in the 1840s. And I suppose his gaze, the way he's looking, is intended to signify a breakthrough moment. So this is part of a series, Great Moments, within the history of medicine, a particularly expert or professional way of looking, if you like. Who he is represented as looking at is one of the enslaved women he kept in his backyard in Alabama to perform gynecological experiments on. So there was no kind of singular moment of breakthrough, as those experiments went on for 4 years, and he has left accounts of the suffering of the women he experimented on. In terms of who is the active agent here, I think these women, and we know the names of 3 of them, Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy, have to be equally configured into the history of medicine as innovators. It's their bodies, their responses to his work that helped him devise medical innovations, even if it's his name that's attached to the instrument. And he was just one, he's probably the most notorious or the best known of these kind of early gynecologists who carried out kind of numerous experiments. In terms of his invention of a new kind of speculum, which continues in use today, Sims emphasized visuality and mystery. And he, this is an extract from his memoir, The Story of My Life. And in this, he's talking about how he took a pewter spoon, bent it, and then inserted the handle into one of his patients. And he says, this is a quote, "I saw everything as no man had ever seen before," and then commissioned a local silversmith to create a speculum to his design based on this kind of bent spoon. So this idea of kind of seeing what nobody has seen before, what no man has ever seen before, is really central to these kind of accounts of technical and medical innovation. And we see echoes of that idea that the mysterious female anatomy is rendered visible to professionals via the speculum. So Sims moved to New York in the 1850s and opened what's sometimes called the first kind of women's hospital there. His experimentation didn't stop and continued mainly on impoverished Irish women, usually maybe fleeing the famine and its after effects, the Great Famine in Ireland. His first patient was Mary Smith, who had recently arrived from Ireland and whom he performed 34 experimental surgeries on. And his assistant published a number of articles on the hospital's work, often remarking that the majority of patients were Irish. From his own writings, and then later Emmett's, the user of the speculum is clearly the physician who's free to experiment, and in later kind of language, found the practice of gynecology through the bodies of those too prostrate to resist, slaves and poor Irish women. And in the medical literature of the time, these two social groupings are described in very similar terms as having an unusually high threshold of pain, and in terms of their value as reproductive. So we can see the development of the speculum in that time and place as being based on this racialized experimentation and on the use of women's bodies, basically. The other notorious use of the speculum in the 19th century is in connection with various legislation to govern venereal disease. So among the earliest laws in relation to this were those passed in 19th century France, when prostitutes were registered and forced to undergo regular examinations for signs of disease in the name of public health. And this regulationist regime was extended to the French colony Algeria in 1830. Well, first of all to Algiers, the city, and then later other cities in Algeria. And it involved the registration and twice monthly speculum inspection of women who registered themselves as prostitutes, and they were inspected for signs of disease. And one contemporary reporter in Paris in the 1830s said the speculum was described by sex workers as the penis of the government. One in Algeria in the 1840s reported it as being the mirror of the government. So I think both those phrases are highly telling, really, in relation to considering the speculum and its use and users. The penis of the government, indicative of the experience by the person whose body feels and experiences the speculum at what's called the distal end in medical device design kind of terminology, and then as a mirror for visualizing and governing by the user at what's called the proximal end. Okay, next slide. Actually, I'm going to skip that one. These kind of laws, a further means by which the use of the speculum became notorious, were laws modeled on those French ones that were passed, first of all in 1864 and then extended later in 1866 and 69 by the British government. And these laws were in response to their inquiry into venereal disease in the military. So they estimated that over 1/3 of British soldiers and sailors were infected with syphilis and gonorrhea in particular. And the origins, site, and circulation of illness was located in women. And the effects of these laws was basically the curtailment of women and their activities. So by these laws, the shorthand is the CDAs, or Contagious Diseases Acts, certain towns throughout the British Empire, in particular those containing military bases and naval stations, the laws meant that any woman suspected of being a prostitute could be stopped and forced to undergo an inspection by speculum to ascertain if she had a venereal disease. And if she didn't submit willingly, she could be arrested and brought before a magistrate. And if she was found to be infected, she could be effectively kind of incarcerated in what was called a lock hospital. So these laws and versions of them were passed throughout the empire in parts of Britain, India, Ireland, Malta, New Zealand, and in the Cape Colony as well. In terms of women's experience under the Acts, this is an extract I'm going to read from a critical summary of the evidence before the Royal Commission upon the Contagious Diseases Acts. So most of the places that the contagious diseases were in effect had some kind of form of inquiry. So this is the British one. And this is a quotation from an interview or testimony with a doctor who was kind of instrumental in carrying out the acts in a particular town in Britain. And he said, "The specula used by the present visiting surgeon are the two smaller sizes of Ferguson's glass specula." So this is what we see on the screen, these kind of nested specula. "The statement of women that they have been wounded by the examination cannot be true of Ferguson's glass speculum, which is of thick glass and could not break. But some specula, the expanding one for instance, is very liable to cut in a rapid use of it, and if not judiciously managed, a rough introduction of any kind of speculum might create an abrasion of the parts." And there's a lot of kind of contradictions in these inquiries where they say that the examination takes no more than 3 minutes, and yet at the same time they're saying if the examination is too rapid, it will, you know, cause injury to the women. the voice of the women actually inspected are often absent from these reports, or their speech is reported, often to play down the effect of these kind of forced examinations. In Britain, there was a very vociferous campaign against the acts, and these often focused in fairly lurid terms on the use of the speculum. So this phrase "steel rape" is sometimes used in relation to the use of the speculum. This is an extract from a letter by a woman who'd been examined under the acts, and she said, "It is awful work. The attitude they push us into first is so disgusting and so painful, and then these monstrous instruments, often they use several. They seem to tear open the passage first with their hands and examine us, and then they thrust in instruments." In the Cape, protests against the CDAs tended to be organized by the Women's Christian Temperance Union from the 1880s, and they tended to focus on a number of factors, including the fact that the laws, by compelling women to register as prostitutes, seemed to tolerate prostitution, and also that they focused on women as solely responsible for the spread of disease. And they use this terminology, repository of disease. There are other kind of more informal protests. For example, in 1893, when women confined in the Cape Town Lock Hospital rioted, or the newspaper headlines kind of say created a disturbance against one particularly notorious doctor who inspected them. And these are quotations, and they appear in this really good article by Elizabeth van Heiningen. So these are women who are involved in these kind of disturbances. And one says, "We all object to the instrument he uses, which hurts us." And the other one also kind of mentions the use of the speculum. "He does this himself using the large instrument. He uses us roughly." So the women themselves are speaking about their experience of the instrument. But again, there's a formal report into this from 1906. And this it enumerates the number of women registered and inspected in each part of the Cape. So we see here on the screen, so Cape Town, number of women remaining on the register, European coloured, voluntary submissions, compulsory submissions, and so on. But they don't, it's funny, that report doesn't focus on the means of inspection. It's kind of producing statistics. What's interesting, I suppose, as well, is that many doctors and others that provided testimony in the British inquiry into the acts said that the speculum inspections were highly ineffective in actually identifying syphilis, and that the visual identification of the disease was extremely difficult. And as such, while the speculum was part of this extremely invasive and deeply controversial visual policing of women and actual policing and incarceration of women, its actual effectiveness was absolutely questionable, and even questioned by doctors giving testimony at these inquiry. And so we might think, well, what was the use of it then? We can think it's part of the biopolitics of producing statistics on unruly bodies. We might consider the speculum as a deterrent. We might also consider it as demonstrative of who had access to women's bodies, who had the right to examine and inspect them, and then to produce or describe them as reservoirs of disease. If the Contagious Diseases Acts were a form of, as have been written about, a form of state violence against women, the speculum has continued to be used in kind of nefarious ways up to the present. And this is a selection of headlines, mainly about mandatory speculum exams for incarcerated women, or those seeking birth control, indeed, in particular states in the US. So we can see, for example, freed Pussy Riot members say prison was a time of endless humiliations. They had to undergo forced speculum gynecological exams every day. Women seeking birth control get unneeded pelvic exams. Brooklyn woman forced to get pap smear at Rikers, at this prison, on arrest. I think they've discontinued that practice, but certainly the use of the speculum in these situations still continues in various places. The other way the speculum has been kind of analysed and studied is as, in some way, a liberatory tool, particularly in second wave feminism in Britain and the United States, when radical health collectives, such as the Los Angeles Women's Center, and we see here this pamphlet with kind of Wonder Woman holding a speculum saying, with my speculum, I am strong, I can fight. When health collectives, such as the Los Angeles Women's Center, distributed speculums, torches, and mirrors to encourage women to have bodily self-knowledge. I suppose this then was an attempt to reconfigure the speculum to some degree, to reintegrate the visual and the tactile aspects of the instrument in a kind of materialization of debates about gynecological practices, expertise, and alienation. So in terms of kind of forness in this reclamation of the speculum then, who it's for and who the user was reassigned. This approach has been criticized, for example, by the writer Donna Haraway, who wrote, and I have the quote up there on the screen, that more than a little amnesiac about how colonial travel narratives work, we peered inside our vaginas towards the distant cervix and said something like, land ho, we have discovered ourselves and claimed the new territory for women. And she describes this as an inherently kind of colonial practice, but others since then have kind of discounted that, and you know, it's still a matter of debate amongst historians of feminism. This idea of reassigning the user is also central to the work of Gynypunk, who are this hacker collective based between Catalonia and Argentina. And they aim to make examination and diagnostic tools available and kind of take them maybe out of the hands of medical professionals. And this includes cytological equipment, so women can analyze their own cells. So that's what we see on the screen there. And it also includes 3D printed speculums, the files for which are made available online. However, so that's what we see on the screen here, one of these 3D printed speculums. I think though this remains on the level of speculative design, it can't actually be used as a speculum due to the materials it's made out of. It's not kind of medical grade. And while it materializes ideas maybe about power, looking, and the user, the dimensions of its design don't make it easy for an individual to hold and use in themselves. So the kind of the medical origins and who is using it are still kind of designed into the object. This is a commercially available speculum here. So a kind of a truism within design education and design marketing, particularly in the last 10 or 20 years, is the concept of user-centered design, sometimes also called human-centered design, which sometimes takes the form of understanding objects through the concept of affordance. So the perception of the properties of things as activating kind of predetermined schematas. As I hope we've seen in this paper, every object implies a user. Even now, the way the experience and meaning of the speculum as an object is formed through the woman's bodily engagement with the very specific materiality of the speculum is kind of discounted again and again. So looking through promotional literature for commercially produced contemporary specula, for example, like the one on the screen, we see much talk of user-centered design, where the user, and therefore the one who is afforded, is still assumed to be the one holding the speculum in their hands, looking through it with their eyes, not the one at the other end who's being viewed and examined. So for example, here's an extract from promotional literature for the Cusco, for this speculum. Standard design with silent adjustment and machine finished handles for positive handling, double reinforced material for additional strength and maximum viewing for full visualization of the field. So they're talking about it being kind of user-centered, but again, not really thinking of kind of the other end of the speculum. In fact, in trying to find a speculum that is described, or specula that are described, to really consider kind of both ends of the instrument, we find that it's through them being sold as sex toys where this really happens. For example, this ad on the Uber Kinky website, which actually talks about the speculum as a masochistic or sadistic kind of tool, and actually speaks about the person who's not operating the speculum but is at the other kind of end of it. And then just finally, this is one attempt to redesign the speculum, a recent attempt. This is called the Yonah. It's a prototype for a new kind of speculum, which is supposed to be kind of more considerate of kind of how it feels as well as how it is looked through. But it's as yet a prototype due allegedly to doctors being reluctant to learn how to use it. So again, privileging them as users despite the known ill effects of women not wanting to undergo smear tests due to their discomfort around the speculum and high levels of cervical cancer as a result of that. So even this supposedly most user-friendly example divorces the user from the world of medical professionals. And by this failure to see use and user as existing within a kind of a network of power and visualization, I think it's doubtful whether it'll be widely adopted. So this kind of deeper consideration of use of the forness of this design has the potential to open up broader thinking about the entire context in which the speculum and other medical instruments are used and the nature of medical examinations themselves. And I think only then can its pretty notorious history be fully reckoned with and perhaps overcome. So thank you. Stop sharing maybe. Okay. So I'd be really happy to discuss or answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Lisa. We will take questions. Thanks for that presentation. I think it's such an example of science and technology studies or that design and material cultures area in which it's so hard to disentangle the object from the person. The tool, the user and who is the user on either side of it, the systems in which it takes place, the politics around it, and the social control. So, I mean, it really raises interesting questions around, especially with the second wave feminist use of the speculum, about whether the problem is with the specific design of the instrument or whether it's to do with what the intention is and the use is and how it's used. So yeah, I think it's a very interesting example of that enmeshment or that entanglement of technology. Do we have any questions for Lisa to start off with? I think the way that the controls are set on this group, you may find it difficult to unmute yourself, but I think the host can see when you do want to unmute yourself.
We can unmute actually.
Okay. People can unmute. Okay, great. I mean, fragments of, I guess, theories or texts were coming into my mind, works that I don't know well, but phrases that came to me like scopic regimes, thinking of, this movement from feeling to seeing, which seem very significant. Also at the end, when you talked about questions about the whole nature of the medical examination, whether it made me think of, is there a place for feeling and for the hands or for touch instead of an instrument which is designed for seeing, if there's something fundamental about that can be questioned. I mean, in the text that you're preparing, the longer text, are you looking at two particular theories? Like, also makes me think of discipline and punish, this idea of the way that the disciplining of women was also used almost as a means of punishment of sex workers as well. Yeah, what are you looking to in your larger text?
I mean, I suppose, Foucault's obviously there in a way, it's pretty hard to avoid him, and especially this kind of production of knowledge, production of statistics. And I think I was really, really struck when I started doing more primary research and really looking at all that testimony and kind of doing a deep dive into it, just how many doctors said that the speculum was not helpful at all. And that really struck me, and I don't think that's really been kind of written about enough. I suppose I'm kind of looking at theories of material culture and kind of this idea of use being distributed between people and objects and networks and contexts, I suppose. So going kind of beyond the focus on the object. But I do think it's interesting to look at the actual object, because if you look, and to kind of attend pretty closely to the forms, if you look at the Ferguson speculum, it's a tube. And this is the one that, well, it's the only one that's mentioned as being kind of standard equipment of these doctors that are inspecting the women under the CDAs. So it's kind of interesting that that's a tube, and then all the other ones have some idea of expansion or contraction or whatever. So I suppose I'm also looking at a little bit at who has kind of access to bodies. So the other kind of main kind of speculum there is an oral speculum that are sometimes used on in the Atlantic slave trade. And I found a lot of testimony from, say, Liverpool, of people kind of purchasing them at the same time as there's Irish women coming over, being prostitutes, being arrested then later on under the CDAs. And then the movement against the CDAs in Britain anyway leads directly into the suffragette movement and force feeding. So there's a whole kind of range there of kind of access to the body through certain technologies and instruments and so on. So that's a part of it as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, Foucault's obviously, pretty, he's kind of he's there very strongly, but there's this, and kind of maybe some newer writing on kind of biopolitics as well.
Yeah. Well, that's when you mentioned part of the use or intention of it perhaps being to demonstrate the right that the state has to your body, and in those examples you mentioned of the oral speculum as well, it's like they can introduce food to your body, they can see into your orifices, they can demonstrate that. And you mentioned pussy riots as being an example of how they were forcibly subjected to the speculum. So I think the Russian state demonstrating that right.
Yeah. Also, I mean, looking at the letters of the women who they're not necessarily protesting, but they're writing to kind of this woman Josephine Butler, who kind of leads the movement in Britain, and they're saying they're talking about being suspected of being a prostitute and then suddenly being kind of forcibly arrested, forcibly examined, and so on. So that idea of who has the right to be in the public sphere is also kind of pretty important.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So that's important. So some places, like I think in the Cape, it's women who are registered. In other places, it's all done at a very local level. In other places, if you're out in public as a woman without a chaperone, or if you're out in public with a sailor, you can be suspected, and the first thing they do is examine you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's kind of, so those ideas of the separate spheres of, the domestic being assigned, female, and the public assigned male. And people say, well, that's often to do with middle class women. I think it's also to do with working class women through the operation of the CDA. So there's a kind of spatial politics to it as well. Yeah.
Great. And if anybody wants to ask a question or make a comment, you can also use the emojis or the reactions button in Zoom and put your hand up, and we'll pick you out. Mick, thanks for joining us. It's good to see you here. Do you have any? And the chat is open as well. Divine comments. Let's see. And Minga has his hand up. And would you like to turn your video on when you ask your question, Minga?
Yes, thank you.
Hi.
Hi, Lisa.
Hi.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. I'm an anthropologist, so I'm quite happy you have touched on the medical anthropology, where you spoke about the body. I've taken a couple of notes while you were talking here, and this is a comment, and at the same time, it can also be a question. So I'm looking at, if you look at the Eden campus at Cape Town, which is part of UCT, we have a space where there's a room an old room called anatomical room, where they used to do the experimentation of a body, and I think your presentation touched a lot on how you mentioned the word policing of the body. And also, I think the medicalization of women's bodies, which is quite problematic. And what is so fascinating is to see the challenges that women goes through, and the controller, who is the man, the gaze through which we see diseases, and you use the word a depository of the diseases, which is also problematic because if you look at the way HIV also, I'm using the South African context, how HIV has been portrayed when it was early, even now, it's more gendered, and many diseases are so gendered, we only speak about a woman. I just want to know how much did you go, because you spoke about instrument mostly. That's where your focus of the work is. How much did you go into tapping into the body itself, which I think you've also mentioned that part, speaking about racialized, how racialized it was. So I just want to know how much did you tap into that? Because when you look at medicine, medicine is built on race, is built on experimentation of medicine is based on race. So how much did you go into that? That is beside you looking at instrument itself.
Yeah.
I'd like to see if you can elaborate on that. Thank you.
Thanks. I looked at that mainly in relation to J. Marion Sims in America, that when he's experimenting on slaves, but also because he's not using an anesthetic, so he is kind of describing these women as more tolerant of pain, and he's kind of reporting on them, and then he's kind of equating that then, or he's using the same kind of discourses when he goes to New York and reports on kind of Irish women and how they're responding. And he will often, and then also later on kind of in Liverpool as well, when they're talking about Irish women being prostitutes. And they say mere masses of rottenness. And again, they use that term depository or repository of diseases. So they are, I think race is there very strongly in both those instances. And even the way the speculum is kind of described and kind of who it's intended for, and if there's a way to kind of avoid it, there's, I obviously today was just half an hour, so I've kind of had to cut a lot out. But there's also this idea that women of particular race or particular class don't mind the use of the speculum, that they're somehow, kind of, they're less sensitive. Whereas Sims comes to Europe and he does these kind of public demonstrations, but then he also treats, the Empress Eugenia, and she has a special kind of ivory and ebony speculum made for her. But that's all about kind of delicacy, privacy, and so on. So it's very different. But there's a kind of almost a moral panic about the use of the speculum in the kind of 1840s, that women might enjoy it somehow and therefore be brought kind of lower. So there is a lot of kind of fear around the use of it, but no problem using it on people that they deem, say, prostitutes or of different races. So I hope that answered what you were saying.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. Thanks, Minga. It's interesting. Something that I was struck by with the Sims design is that it looks so different to the other ones. I was expecting from the history that the Sims would be one of the most sort of scary looking ones, but it's actually its design seems different to the other ones that are expanding. The Sims seems like it's somehow more like ergonomic, it's the shape of it seems more like it conforms to a body than the other examples.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah. It does. And then this Ferguson tube one just seems the most kind of useless of all, other than, as an insertion device. It's mirrored on the inside, but yeah. Yeah,
that's definitely just, it's done without any regard to the body. And
it's interesting though, the statue of Sims that was in Central Park, has been taken down now. So there was a campaign to remove it, but it was only just like last year that it was taken down. And, you know, there's a clinic in Ireland, a fertility clinic, and it's called the Sims Fertility Clinic. And until I wrote this newspaper article about it a couple of years ago, and up to then they had, you know, called after the father of American gynecology. This is just happening in the last few years, this kind of his notoriety being kind of more widespread. And it was, you know, who visited the Rotunda Hospital in the 1850s. We proudly call ourselves after him and all the rest. And they've taken that off their website now. It's still called Sims, but it's no longer celebratory. Yeah.
Good. And thinking of that design of the tubular device, Divine has a question in the chat. I don't know if you can see the chat here as well.
Oh yeah.
But he's talking about how to locate this in feminist critiques of design through with phallocratic design, how to degender or dephallocrise design, if I may create those terms.
Phallocrise. Yeah, I mean, I think I saw that there's a patent actually out now, and I just saw this last night, but it's like of a kind of long tube with a digital camera at one end that they're suggesting, particularly because of the high degree of cervical cancer. And they were saying, like, South Africa, it's the cancer that most people kind of die from, that women most commonly die from. And often it's to do with, even if smear tests are available, people not wanting to have them. And so this was being promoted as something that could be, you know, potentially life-saving and change the nature of medical exams. So that's interesting in itself, you know, so the kind of the real kind of implications of all this as well.
Interesting.
But there's, I mean, yeah.
Were you saying something, Divine?
Ralph, there's a question from Wangui in the chat.
Yes.
Oh, I see it now. Sorry, I wasn't looking.
I see that, yeah.
Just wanted to say, oh my God, okay. Yeah, it's awful, yeah. He's saying that his grandmother died, or her grandmother died, after some interventions by a doctor who was experimenting in Black women's bodies, yeah. And then we know this case of Henrietta Lacks, her cells, and you know, there's like Sims is the most notorious, but there's lots and lots and lots of examples. And even in Ireland, where in kind of industrial schools or Magdalen laundries, mother and baby homes, they're finding out there were these vaccine trials carried out there, you know, without people's consent as well. So if you have people that have less power, often that's how kind of medical experimentation, often medical innovation kind of happens, or what we think of as innovation. So Gynaepunk, for example, they've suggested kind of renaming parts of kind of female anatomy after the slaves that Sims experimented on, because often they're saying, you know, parts of women's reproductive organs are called after the men who first kind of identified them. So yeah, they gave one of them, Clow, gave a really funny presentation saying, "I'm covered in men." So.
Well, I guess it's parallels with you quoted Donna Haraway talking about the sort of colonial adventure paradigm and the idea of places being named after their discoverers, that people go and finding things that were already there and giving them their names. Yeah. I mean, one of the research strands in our institution is into the use of future technologies in hospitals and artificial intelligence in particular. And I was thinking about that in terms of the way that the user is defined with the speculum, and with this idea of like who is the user of the technology. And I was trying to apply those thoughts to thinking about possible interactions with AIs, like if we think of, you know, an AI that is patient facing, you know, perhaps like a diagnostic kind of interface for a patient is what, you know, one potential use of AI. And then who the user is. So yeah, I'm wondering if you've thought about applying the ideas that come out of this one instrument to other areas of medical technology, and if this idea of the user, how that works across them.
Yeah, I have a little bit, and I talked to, you know, because if you look at how the history of medical instruments has been written, it's often in this very positivist, taxonomic way. Like there's one kind of, you know, people call it the Bible, you know, one very standard um, textbook that, you know, is mainly referred to even in NCAD. There's a master's in medical device design, and it's all according to, like, there's a chapter called probes and their allies, or for cutting. It's all about the action, you know, of the person kind of holding it. It's not even to do with kind of the part of the body. Enucleators, you know, it's very interesting in terms of kind of a design historical analysis, where design history tends to focus maybe a little bit on, say, the consumer or the user as much as the producer or designer, whereas these are very much about in the hands of the doctor. And even that, those terms proximal and distal is how they describe medical devices in terms of what end you're at.
Yeah, yeah.
And yeah, and so yeah, I've talked to medical device designers kind of in college, and they were saying when they talk about they talk about patient-centered care, but they don't necessarily talk about the actual kind of objects as being patient-centered. When they say user-centered, they mean the doctor. Yeah. So it sounds quite simplistic, but it is kind of interesting when you start thinking of it as a visualizer, and then how it's been used in the past as a visualizer, and that kind of and it was interesting to find that kind of 1580s image and think about kind of microscopes and telescopes and visualization and all the rest.
And how we can work out from objects, work outwards from objects to learn about how things like medicine or notions of care are constructed. And I was wondering, I mean, when you produced the work for Design and Violence, and when I first was introduced to your research, I mean, it was something that struck me is that the speculum is something that half of people are familiar with, as in women being, you know, having it used as part of gynecology, and then majority of men not coming across them unless they're gynecologists, and there being this kind of an everyday object that's experienced by, you know, half of the population, you know, at least, and yet it's something which probably isn't really displayed or talked about very, very much. And have you found any sort of barriers to discussion of it, or have you encountered this idea of it being a kind of hidden thing?
Emails.
Have you?
Yeah, and I'm part of a group that the V&A, the Victoria and Albert Museum, as you said, they've just collected this 3D printed speculum. So they kind of they assembled this kind of focus group to help them interpret it, and I've been writing stuff for them about it, and it includes a trans woman, and she's been talking about her experience of the speculum, as a trans woman, and that's been pretty interesting. And there's someone else who she's a doctor who runs an organization called Decolonizing Contraception, and she's looking at sexually transmitted diseases amongst, in particular, the Afro-Caribbean population of the UK. And she was also saying about sometimes the reluctance to have a smear test can be culturally specific, but also looking at how, you know, medicine is often predicated on kind of white, able-bodied people, and so are these instruments. So and other forms of technology. So I suppose that's been really, really interesting to do that. We've been having a kind of series of workshops, and also a disabled woman as part of that. So, you know, I think we've been thinking about that more than gender in a big way, I think.
And I think more, you're talking more widely as well about different attitudes towards it culturally as well.
So when you look at, for example, the rate of cervical cancer in different places, you know, obviously these are complex problems, but you do wonder if, you know, this reluctance for examination, is that part of it? You know what I mean?
Yeah. And where, and I guess some cultural attitudes are a mix of colonial influence and other influences as well. There's a comment in the chat from my colleague Dominique, And as she's asking, are you aware of specific post-mortem treatments of Black women in the context of the history of gynecology?
I'm not that aware of post-mortem, no. I am aware of, I mean, this is just the last 5 years. I am aware that in Canada, there was a big movement against, or women realized that trainee doctors were practicing how to do smear tests when women were under general anesthetic. So again, the user as, you know, just kind of prone, unconscious, not able to give any kind of feedback. And I thought that was kind of, that was very instructive. No, but I mean, I know more about experimentation on living or alive Black women, but I don't know about post-mortem. But I think some of the talk about repatriation and restitution, I think that's interesting about in terms of kind of respect for the body and access to the body. I think some of those kind of debates are probably relevant with this.
Thanks.
And also this idea that the one woman's body can stand for all women's bodies in terms of experimentation, often less powerful women. Whereas with, you know, when you're looking at Sim's memoir, it's kind of, you know, he's reducing people to their body parts. Whereas if it's someone like, you know, the Empress Eugenia, it's all about her specific speculum. She is completely singularized. She's not produced as a statistic. It's that idea of kind of typecasting and non-typecasting and singularizing, I think, is part of this as well.
Great, thank you, Lisa. I see Minga, and then that will be our last question in terms of our time available for the seminar. So Minga, your hand is up. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Lisa. Again, I'm back again with another question about moving a bit more to the ethical issues here in terms of male gynecologists. You know, what will be your view? Because I recall my father is a medical doctor. My sisters, you know, I come from a medical doctor's families, where I recalled one of my nephew, because that was when we moved to Zambia. We did not have the facility to take our sister to the hospital. And my sister ended up giving birth at home. But luckily, my elder sister was also a medical doctor. Okay. It was quite fascinating to see how, because she wasn't really, she didn't have enough experience. So now she had to coordinate with my father standing at the door of the room where my sister was giving birth. And it was my elder sister who was actually assisting my younger sister to give birth.
Okay.
So it was kind of like a coordination to say, okay, use this tool, use that tool, clamp the ball, because I was also there in a lounge, but this was happening in a room when my mother was there. So now I'm trying to look at the ethical issues here on what is your view in terms of gynecology, history of gynecology, because now I'm looking at, you can see we're not talking about racial issue here. We're talking also about patriarchal, you know, where we find so many gynecologists are male. It's kind of like a male-dominated field. So what is your view on that? I'm not refraining from people from studying gynecology, but I'm just like trying to look at what is your view on that?
Well, no, I mean, I'm not against men studying gynecology or operating as gynecologists. I suppose, I mean, I think it's, you know, I think most people would say, you know, the patient having a voice, the patient being listened to is obviously a massive factor in that. And in Ireland, for example, we have recently had an inquiry into Catholic male gynecologists in the 1950s and 60s undertaking a practice called symphysiotomy, where they would deliberately saw through a woman's pelvis because they thought if they had a cesarean section, then that would prevent them having large families and therefore would be against Catholic teaching. So we're seeing these women, some of them have been rendered incontinent, unable to have sex again, unable to have children again, lifelong pain. And so I think in Ireland, we're very conscious of how ideology informs gynecology in particular, and kind of the whole area of reproduction. So, and, you know, Ireland was a Catholic, very patriarchal society. And I know that it's sometimes similar kind of in other societies that are deeply patriarchal. Issues around childbirth and around gynecology do not go well for the women. So I think that, you know, a more enlightened healthcare system is always going to be one which is attuned to, you know, the patient and what they are saying. But I know myself, having had children in a supposedly less patriarchal society, the big talk, you know, with other friends or with my sisters and everything, is about how the doctors don't listen. They wouldn't do the, you know, they don't listen. They call you a city girl, they patronize you, they infantilize you, and so on. And we've only recently, you know, in Ireland repealed these very strict laws against abortion here. So there's been an awful lot of talk here about kind of reproductive rights and bodily autonomy and so on. So there's a lot of really interesting kind of legal scholars in particular that originally maybe working out of Ireland, but often working in tandem with colleagues in South America, in South Africa, and in other places around that idea of kind of bodily autonomy and the medico-legal kind of complex, if you like, as being often deeply patriarchal. So that's probably, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's also part of kind of where I'm coming from in being interested in this. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you, Minga. So yeah, thanks again for sharing this with us, Lisa. It's a fascinating research. Yeah, and we're looking forward to seeing your paper come out, as well as your work for the V&A Museum. So thanks.
Cheers, Ralph, and thanks everyone for great questions and discussion. Thank you, Minga. It was very nice. I'd love to know more about your work.
Great.
Okay, great.
Thank you, Lisa.
So next week on our Attire seminar series, it'll be Carl Manlin, and he's going to be talking about informal economies in Africa and COVID-19. You've been listening to the Humor Attire seminar series. Thank you very much.
Cheers. Thanks.